The gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder, followed immediately by a sound that would haunt Gregory Williams for the rest of his days: the sharp, agonized yelp of Max, his golden retriever service dog, collapsing onto the concrete sidewalk. Blood spread across the pavement in a crimson pool as Greg dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for his four-legged companion who had saved his life countless times before. The police officers stood over them both, weapons still drawn, their faces stone cold as Greg's world shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Max, no. 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 Greg's voice broke as he cradled the dying dog's head in his lap, feeling the warmth leaving the animal's body. The service dog's brown eyes, usually so alert and protective, began to dim as his breathing grew shallow. Behind the wall of uniformed officers, a middle-aged white woman in a pristine pink cardigan stood with her arms crossed, her lips pursed in satisfaction, as if justice had been served. Karen Mitchell had gotten exactly what she wanted. 20 minutes earlier, Greg had been enjoying what should have been a peaceful morning walk through Maple Grove's quiet residential neighborhood. The sun filtered through the oak trees lining Elm Street, casting dappled shadows on the sidewalk as he moved at a measured pace. Max, walking obediently at his side. The golden retriever wore his official service dog vest, clearly marked with reflective lettering that identified him as a working animal, trained to assist veterans with PTSD. Greg's breathing had been steady for the first time in weeks, the familiar weight of Max's presence beside him, providing the grounding he needed to navigate the outside world. At 34, Greg carried the invisible wounds of 3 tours in Afghanistan, injuries that showed themselves in sudden panic attacks, sleepless nights, and an overwhelming sense of hypervigilance that made simple tasks, like grocery shopping, feel like navigating a minefield. Max had been his lifeline for 2 years now, trained to recognize the early signs of Greg's anxiety attacks and respond with deep pressure therapy, creating space in crowded areas and providing the emotional anchor that kept Greg tethered to reality when his mind threatened to spiral into the darkness of traumatic memories. The morning had started like any other. Greg lived in a small apartment on the south side of town, a modest one-bedroom place he could afford on his disability pension. He'd served his country with honor. Earning a Purple Heart after an IED explosion left him with chronic pain and PTSD. But civilian life had proven more challenging than any battlefield. Simple interactions with neighbors often left him drained, and large crowds could trigger panic attacks that lasted for hours. Max made all the difference, providing not just companionship, but the specific training that allowed Greg to function in daily life. As they walked down Elm Street, Greg noticed the way morning joggers smiled and nodded when they saw Max, recognizing the working dog's importance. Children walking to school with their parents often pointed excitedly at the beautiful golden retriever, and Greg always felt a small surge of pride at how well-trained and gentle Max was with everyone they encountered. The dog had never shown aggression toward another person or animal, his temperament carefully selected and honed through months of professional training. Karen Mitchell had been watching from her front window, as she did every morning, surveying the neighborhood with the self-appointed authority of someone who believed she owned every inch of sidewalk within her sightline. At 57, Karen had lived in the same house on Elm Street for 15 years, during which time she had filed numerous complaints with the city about everything from slightly overgrown lawns to children playing too loudly in their own backyards. She served on the Homeowners Association board and attended every city council meeting, usually armed with a list of grievances about the declining standards of their once pristine neighborhood. When Karen spotted Greg and Max approaching, her jaw tightened with familiar irritation. She had seen them before. This black man with his large dog, walking through what she considered her territory. The fact that the dog wore a service vest meant nothing to her. She had read online that anyone could buy those vests, that people use them to bring untrained animals into stores and restaurants. She had already called the police twice in the past month about Greg, claiming he was loitering suspiciously and letting his dog intimidate other pedestrians. Though both calls had resulted in officers who found nothing wrong and politely suggested she mind her own business. But this morning, Karen had decided she'd had enough. As Greg and Max walked peacefully down the sidewalk, maintaining perfect heel position and bothering no one, Karen marched out of her house with her phone already in hand. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp with manufactured authority. "You can't have that animal here. This is a residential area, not a dog park." Greg stopped walking and turned toward her, his training kicking in as he tried to de-escalate what seemed like a misunderstanding. Max remained perfectly still beside him, sensing his handler's slight increase in stress and positioning himself accordingly. "Ma'am, this is my service dog," Greg said calmly, gesturing to Max's clearly marked vest. "We're just taking a walk on the public sidewalk. We're not causing any trouble." Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked Greg up and down, taking in his neat appearance, his respectful demeanor, and his obvious attempt to avoid conflict. None of it mattered to her worldview, which had been shaped by years of consuming fear-based media and nurturing grievances against anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of belonging. "I don't care what that vest says," she snapped, stepping closer with aggressive posture. "Anyone can buy those online. That animal looks dangerous, and I don't feel safe with it in my neighborhood. You people are always trying to get away with something." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Greg felt his chest tighten with the familiar sensation of being reduced to a stereotype rather than seen as an individual. Max pressed closer to his leg, responding to the subtle changes in Greg's breathing and heart rate that signaled the beginning of an anxiety response. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but Max is professionally trained," Greg said, his voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. "He's registered as a service animal. We have every right to be here, and we're not bothering anyone." Karen's face flushed red with indignation at being challenged. In her mind, Greg's calm response was proof of his guilt. Innocent people would have apologized and left immediately. She pulled out her phone and began dialing. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice rising to ensure nearby neighbors could hear. 911. "Yes, I need police immediately. There's a dangerous animal in my neighborhood, and the owner is being aggressive and threatening. I don't feel safe." Greg's heart rate spiked as he listened to Karen's fabricated version of events. He had done nothing aggressive or threatening, had spoken politely, and tried to explain the situation, but somehow he was being painted as the aggressor. Max pressed against his leg more firmly, providing deep pressure therapy as his training dictated. But Greg could feel the familiar edges of panic beginning to creep in. "Ma'am, please," Greg said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "You're misrepresenting what happened. I haven't threatened anyone. We're just trying to take a walk." But Karen was already embellishing her story to the 911 dispatcher, describing an imaginary scene where Greg had made threatening gestures and his dog had shown aggressive behavior toward other pedestrians. She painted herself as a concerned citizen, protecting her community from a dangerous individual with an uncontrolled animal, weaving a narrative that played into every stereotype and fear that might motivate a quick police response. "He's a large black male, probably in his 30s, with a big dog that's not under control," Karen said into the phone, loud enough for Greg to hear every word. "I think he might be on drugs. He's acting erratically and won't leave when I asked him to. The dog looks vicious. I'm afraid it might attack someone." Greg felt the world beginning to tilt as Karen's lies accumulated into a false reality that would soon bring armed officers to a situation that had started as nothing more than a peaceful walk. He knew from experience how these encounters could go wrong, had seen the news stories, and heard the statistics about black men killed during police encounters that began with minor or fabricated complaints. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers arrived on scene, their lights flashing and sirens wailing as if responding to a genuine emergency. Officers James Patterson and Michael Torres emerged from their vehicles with hands already resting on their weapons, their eyes immediately focusing on Greg and Max, with the heightened alertness of officers who had been told they were dealing with a dangerous situation. Officer Patterson, a 20-year veteran of the force, approached with his partner while keeping his hand near his service weapon. Both officers had received limited training in de-escalation and even less education about service animals. But they had absorbed years of implicit bias training that taught them to see certain scenarios as inherently more threatening than others. "Sir, we received reports of a disturbance," Patterson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "We need you to step away from the animal and put your hands where we can see them." Greg raised his hands slowly, his military training telling him to comply completely, while his veteran instincts screamed that something was about to go terribly wrong. Max remained in position beside him, confused by the sudden arrival of multiple strangers, but still focused on his primary job of monitoring Greg's stress levels, which were spiking dangerously high. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding," Greg said carefully, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "This is my service dog. We were just walking down the sidewalk when this woman approached us and called 911. We haven't done anything wrong." Karen immediately interjected, her voice pitched to carry maximum dramatic effect. "That's not true. He was aggressive and threatening, and that dog was off-leash and acting vicious. I was afraid for my safety and the safety of other people in the neighborhood." Officer Torres looked between Greg and Karen, trying to assess the situation, while his training told him to prioritize the complaint of the woman who had called for help. Max's service vest was clearly visible, but Torres had heard stories about people faking service animals, and the 911 call had described a dangerous dog that needed to be controlled. "Sir, we need you to secure that animal," Torres said, drawing his weapon as a precautionary measure. "We can't have a potentially dangerous dog loose in a residential area." "He's not loose," Greg said, desperation beginning to creep into his voice as he saw the officer's gun. "He's a trained service animal. Look at his vest. He's professionally trained to help veterans with PTSD. He's never been aggressive with anyone." But the officers were operating on the information they had received from dispatch, filtered through Karen's fabricated emergency call. In their perception, they were dealing with a potentially dangerous individual who was refusing to control a vicious animal that posed a threat to public safety. The fact that the dog appeared calm and well-behaved contradicted their expectations, making them more suspicious rather than less. Max, sensing the rising tension and his handler's increasing distress, began to perform his trained response to Greg's anxiety attack. The golden retriever moved closer to Greg's leg and gently placed his paws on Greg's thigh, providing the deep pressure therapy that helped ground his handler during panic episodes. To the untrained observers, however, the dog's movement looked like a potential attack stance. "The dog is attacking!" Karen screamed, though Max had done nothing more than provide the medical response he was trained to give. "Shoot it. It's going to bite him." Officer Patterson's perception of the situation crystallized into the narrative he had been primed to expect. He saw a large dog making aggressive contact with a person, heard a civilian screaming about an attack, and reacted with the split-second decision-making that his training had taught him to rely on in dangerous situations. The gunshot shattered the morning quiet, followed immediately by Max's agonized cry as the bullet found its mark. The golden retriever collapsed onto the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath his golden fur as his life ebbed away in front of the man who loved him more than his own safety. Greg dropped to his knees beside Max, his hands shaking as he tried to stop the bleeding. But the damage was too severe. The service dog who had given him the courage to leave his apartment, who had pulled him back from the edge of suicide on more than one dark night, who had loved him unconditionally through the worst moments of his recovery, was dying because of one woman's prejudice and fear. "You killed him," Greg sobbed, his voice breaking as Max's breathing became shallow and irregular. "He never hurt anyone. He was trying to help me. He was just doing his job." The officers approached cautiously, still treating Greg as a potential threat, despite the obvious devastation of losing his service animal. Officer Patterson kept his weapon drawn, while Torres moved to restrain Greg, interpreting his grief as potential resistance. "Sir, you need to step away from the animal and put your hands behind your back," Torres ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for disturbing the peace and failure to control a dangerous animal." The charges were nonsensical. Max had been under perfect control and had never posed a threat to anyone, but Greg was too devastated to argue, as Torres forced his arms behind his back and secured the cuffs. He was dragged away from Max's body and shoved into the back of a police cruiser while Karen stood on her front lawn, arms crossed in vindication as she watched the scene unfold, exactly as she had orchestrated. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that more units were arriving to secure what the police now considered a crime scene. But several neighbors had witnessed the entire encounter from their windows and doorways. Maria Santos, who lived 3 houses down from Karen, had watched the peaceful interaction between Greg and Max turn deadly because of one woman's false accusations. "That's not what happened at all," Maria said to her husband as they watched from their front porch. "I saw the whole thing. That man wasn't doing anything wrong, and his dog was perfectly behaved. Karen made the whole thing up." Dr. Jennifer Lee, a veterinarian who lived across the street, had also witnessed the shooting and was horrified by what she had seen. She had recognized Max's service dog vest and training immediately, had watched the animal provide textbook anxiety support to his handler, and had seen Officer Patterson shoot a working service animal that posed no threat to anyone. "That was a service dog," she told her teenage daughter, who was recording the aftermath on her phone. "That officer just killed a trained medical support animal because that woman lied about what happened." As news of the shooting spread through social media, thanks to videos captured by witnesses, the true story began to emerge in stark contrast to the narrative Karen had created. The footage showed Greg walking peacefully with Max, Karen approaching them aggressively, and the dog providing medical support to his handler, exactly as he had been trained to do before being shot by police, who had been misled about the nature of the situation. Greg spent 18 hours in jail before being released on his own recognizance. The charges against him quietly dropped when the prosecutor's office realized they had no evidence of any actual crime. But by the time he returned to his apartment, Max's body had been disposed of by animal control, and Greg faced the devastating reality of navigating his PTSD without the service animal who had made his daily survival possible. The story might have ended there, buried in local news, and forgotten by everyone except the man whose life had been shattered, if not for the determination of neighbors who refused to let Karen's lies stand unchallenged. Maria Santos had been documenting Karen's pattern of harassment for months, keeping detailed records of her complaints against various residents who didn't meet her approval. "This isn't the first time," Maria told reporters when local news stations picked up the story. Karen has called police on the Martinez family for having too many cars in their driveway, on the Johnson kids for playing basketball in their own backyard, and on Mr. Chen for the smell of cooking coming from his kitchen windows. She targets anyone who doesn't look like her version of the perfect neighbor. Dr. Lee had also been keeping records, prompted by her own encounters with Karen's complaints about her Asian heritage and her foreign landscaping choices. When she learned about Max's death, she reached out to other neighbors and discovered a systematic pattern of harassment that stretched back years. Karen complained to the city about my Japanese maple tree being inappropriate for the neighborhood character. Dr. Lee revealed during a community meeting that drew more than 200 residents. She called code enforcement on the Patel family for their Diwali decorations, claiming they were fire hazards. She even tried to get Mrs. Washington evicted from her rental house by claiming her grandson's visits were gang activity, when he's a college student who comes to help with her groceries. The revelations painted a picture of sustained racial harassment, disguised as neighborhood concern, with Karen using city services and police resources to weaponize her prejudices against anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of acceptable residence. The death of Max became a symbol of how her false reports could escalate to deadly consequences. Local civil rights organizations took notice when the story went viral on social media, with HOA Justice for Max trending nationally as people shared their own experiences with false police reports, motivated by racial bias. The NAACP announced they were investigating the case, while veterans organizations expressed outrage that a disabled veteran service animal had been killed because of fabricated complaints. Animal rights groups joined the chorus of criticism, with the American Service Dog Registry issuing a statement about the importance of properly trained service animals and the devastating impact of false reports that endangered both the animals and their disabled handlers. The organization offered to provide replacement training for Greg at no cost, though everyone understood that no dog could truly replace Max. The pressure on city officials intensified when investigative reporters discovered that Karen had filed over 40 complaints with various city departments in the past 3 years, with a suspicious pattern of targeting residents of color while ignoring similar issues in homes owned by white families. Her complaints had consumed thousands of hours of city employee time and resources, creating a paper trail of harassment disguised as civic engagement. Mayor Patricia Williams faced growing calls for accountability during packed city council meetings, where residents demanded answers about how Karen's pattern of false reports had been allowed to continue unchecked for so long. Greg attended one of these meetings, speaking publicly for the first time since Max's death about the impact of losing his service animal. Max wasn't just a pet, Greg told the crowded council chamber, his voice steady but heavy with grief. He was my lifeline. He kept me alive during panic attacks, helped me sleep through the night, and gave me the confidence to leave my apartment and try to be part of this community. Karen's lies didn't just cost him his life, they've taken away my ability to function in daily life. The emotional testimony moved many in the audience to tears, while others expressed anger at the system that had allowed Karen's harassment to escalate to deadly consequences. City council members promised investigations and policy changes, but residents demanded more concrete action against both Karen and the officers who had responded with lethal force to a fabricated emergency. The federal investigation that followed revealed disturbing patterns in the police department's response to calls involving people of color, with data showing that officers were significantly more likely to use force during encounters that began with complaints from white residents about Black or Latino community members. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation, while the FBI began examining whether Karen's pattern of false reports constituted federal hate crimes. Karen found herself facing multiple lawsuits as her victims organized to seek justice through the courts. Greg filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against both Karen and the police department, seeking damages for the wrongful death of Max and the violation of his rights as a disabled veteran. The Martinez family sued for harassment, the Johnsons for false imprisonment after their teenage son was arrested based on Karen's fabricated complaint, and Dr. Lee for discriminatory targeting based on her ethnicity. The legal pressure intensified when prosecutors announced criminal charges against Karen for filing false police reports, a felony in their jurisdiction that carried potential jail time and significant fines. The district attorney explained that Karen's pattern of behavior went far beyond simple complaints, constituting a systematic abuse of emergency services that had endangered multiple families and ultimately led to the death of a service animal. During the highly publicized trial, witnesses testified about Karen's escalating harassment campaign and its devastating effects on the community. Neighbors described feeling afraid to leave their homes. Children talked about being afraid to play outside. And families revealed they had considered moving away from the neighborhood they had once loved because of Karen's constant surveillance and complaints. The prosecution presented evidence of Karen's social media posts, where she had shared articles about property values and neighborhood character that used thinly veiled racist language to justify her targeting of minority residents. Her internet search history revealed a pattern of researching dangerous dog breeds, gang identification, and property crime statistics before filing specific complaints against her neighbors. Karen's defense attorney tried to portray her as a concerned citizen who had been genuinely afraid for her safety. But the evidence of her systematic targeting and the peaceful nature of her alleged victims undermined this narrative. The jury heard testimony from animal behavior experts who explained that Max had never shown any signs of aggression and had been performing his trained medical response when he was shot. The trial became a focal point for discussions about racial bias, police accountability, and the weaponization of emergency services by individuals motivated by prejudice. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs with Max's picture and demanding justice for all of Karen's victims. When the guilty verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in applause from community members who had endured years of Karen's harassment. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to pay substantial restitution to her victims, including funds for Greg to obtain and train a new service animal. The police officers involved faced their own consequences, with Officer Patterson terminated from the force and charged with reckless endangerment for shooting Max without adequate justification. Officer Torres received a suspension and mandatory retraining, though many community members felt the punishment was insufficient for his role in the incident. The city agreed to a substantial settlement with Greg and implemented new policies requiring additional training for officers responding to calls involving service animals. The police department established a new protocol for verifying complaints before responding with force, while the city created an oversight board with community representation to review patterns of complaints and prevent future harassment campaigns. As the legal proceedings concluded and Karen began serving her sentence, the Elm Street neighborhood began to heal from years of tension and division. The community that had been fractured by one woman's prejudices found new strength in their shared commitment to justice and inclusivity. Greg received his new service dog, a young golden retriever named Hope, whose training honored Max's memory while providing the support Greg needed to continue his recovery. The new dog wore a special patch with Max's picture, ensuring that the original service animal's sacrifice would never be forgotten. Dr. Lee organized monthly neighborhood gatherings that brought residents together to celebrate their diversity and strengthen the bonds that Karen had tried so hard to break. Maria Santos started a neighborhood watch program focused on supporting vulnerable residents rather than surveilling them. while the Johnson children organized youth activities that welcomed all families regardless of their background. The house where Karen had lived became a symbol of transformation when it was purchased by a young black family with two small children. Their moving day celebrated by neighbors who brought welcome gifts and offered to help with unpacking. The front yard where Karen had once stood and fabricated her emergency call was now filled with children's laughter and the sound of new friendships being formed. Greg found himself becoming an unexpected advocate for service animal rights and police reform, speaking at conferences and workshops about the importance of proper training and the deadly consequences of false reports. His testimony helped pass state legislation, creating stronger penalties for interfering with service animals and requiring enhanced police training for encounters involving people with disabilities. On the first anniversary of Max's death, the community held a memorial service that drew hundreds of supporters from across the region. A small monument was installed in the neighborhood park, dedicated to Max and all service animals who provide life-saving support to veterans and people with disabilities. Hope sat quietly beside Greg during the ceremony, her own training now complete, and her bond with her handler growing stronger each day. She would never replace Max in Greg's heart, but she represented the community's commitment to ensuring that no other veteran would lose their lifeline because of prejudice and false accusations. As the sun set on the memorial ceremony, Greg walked slowly home along the same sidewalk where Max had died, Hope maintaining perfect heel position as she had been trained. Neighbors waved from their porches. Children stopped to pet Hope with permission, and the street buzzed with the warm energy of a community that had learned to stand together against hatred and division. The transformation was not complete. Healing from such deep wounds takes time, and vigilance against future prejudice requires constant effort. But the neighborhood had proven that ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary cruelty, that justice could prevail over hatred, and that even in the face of devastating loss, communities could choose hope over fear, unity over division, and love over prejudice. Greg's apartment now contained framed photos of both Max and Hope, along with letters from veterans across the country who had been inspired by his story to seek help for their own PTSD and to fight for their rights as disabled Americans. The tragedy that had nearly destroyed his life had become a catalyst for change that reached far beyond one neighborhood, touching the lives of countless others who had experienced similar discrimination and injustice. Karen's empty house served as a daily reminder of the consequences of hatred, while the vibrant community around it demonstrated the power of people choosing to build bridges rather than walls, to celebrate differences rather than fear them, and to protect the vulnerable rather than target them. The story of Max's death and the community's response became a case study in police departments across the country, used to train officers about implicit bias, proper procedures for service animal encounters, and the importance of verifying complaints before responding with force. The changes implemented in response to the tragedy prevented similar incidents in dozens of other communities, ensuring that Max's sacrifice saved other service animals and their handlers from similar fates. As Greg settled into his routine with Hope, the nightmares that had plagued him since Max's death began to fade. The new service dog's presence provided the same grounding and support that Max had given, while the knowledge that his beloved companion's death had sparked meaningful change brought a measure of peace to his grieving heart. The neighborhood children who had witnessed the shooting and its aftermath carried important lessons about justice, courage, and standing up for what is right. They had seen adults choose to fight hatred with love, to respond to violence with organized, peaceful resistance, and to transform tragedy into an opportunity for positive change. Hope's gentle presence beside Greg as they walked through the neighborhood served as a living symbol of resilience, healing, and the power of communities to overcome even the deepest divisions. The golden retriever wore her service vest with pride, knowing that she carried the legacy of another dog who had died trying to protect his handler from the cruelty of a prejudiced world. The final chapter of this story was still being written in the daily interactions between neighbors who had learned to see past surface differences, in the policy changes that protected other service animals, and in the strengthened bonds between community members who had discovered their shared humanity in the face of senseless hatred. Max's memory lived on, not just in the hearts of those who loved him, but in the positive changes that his death had inspired, ensuring that his brief life had lasting meaning and impact. The morning sun now rises over a transformed neighborhood, where children of all backgrounds play together in yards that were once divided by suspicion and fear. Greg walks these same streets with hope, knowing that while the pain of losing Max will never fully heal, the love and support of his community has given both loss and memory a purpose that extends far beyond the tragedy that brought them together. In the end, Karen's attempt to destroy what she saw as threats to her narrow worldview had instead created something beautiful, a community united by their commitment to justice, inclusion, and the protection of all who needed support and understanding. Max's legacy lived on in every life that was changed, every policy that was reformed, and every moment when neighbors chose love over fear.